The Daily Telegraph actually had the most detailed briefing from within Harry and Meghan's camps. Harry has told friends in the US that he is excited for his children to reconnect with his grandfather, even though we know that there is no confirmation of that meeting. The source said, Harry says he's coming back before the end of the year with the children with the express intent to reunite with his dad.
Spidey senses are tingling, and when a journalist who has spent years reading quiet signals before the loud ones hit says something is moving faster than anyone is letting on, you stop and pay attention. What's being whispered right now isn't just that Harry is coming back for the Invictus Games in July. It's that this time is different. He may be staying far longer than one event requires. His wife and children could be traveling with him. And something nobody is quite saying what yet has shifted the timeline. Not a catastrophe, but an urgency. A clock somewhere ticking faster than it was just a few months ago. Once you start looking at the pieces being assembled around this trip, it becomes very hard to look away. Weak signals are notoriously tricky to read in royal reporting. This family has spent decades perfecting the art of saying nothing while meaning everything. A shift in tone from a guarded source, a scheduling detail that doesn't quite add up, a sentence dropped almost casually into a routine briefing.
There's a phrase in politics and diplomacy that, it's only really worth understanding weak political signals, because if anyone can read a strong political signal, right? But if you can read a weak political signal, that's a lot of what you do. And I am starting to feel my spidey senses tingling, that there is something going on in terms of Harry coming back to the UK. We know he's coming back for the Invictus Games in July. I understand he could be in England for quite a bit longer than just the sort of one day that event requires.
None of it means much on its own, but together, that's exactly what seasoned royal watchers are trained to catch, because by the time a story becomes an official announcement, the real decision was already made weeks earlier behind a door no one was invited through. That's exactly where we are right now, not waiting for confirmation, but watching for the signal underneath the silence. And those signals are coming thick and fast enough that even the most cautious observers are starting to sit up straight. Now let's talk about what's actually been confirmed, because in a story like this one, the difference between what's being said and what's actually known matters enormously. What has been confirmed is that Harry told friends in the United States that he's excited for his children to reconnect with their grandfather. That detail is consistent across multiple outlets, repeated almost word for word, like everyone is drawing from the same original source. What has not been confirmed and remains entirely unconfirmed is whether any meeting will actually happen, where it might take place, or who would be in the room. That gap between the warm language being briefed out and the cold silence coming from the palace itself, that's where this entire story lives.
Time is something that you can never get back. And, he regretted the time when his mother passed, the time he could not get back. And once again, he is falling into a position where he is losing out, and time is going to keep going. And, it waits for no one. And it's going to be a huge regret for Harry. And I think it will cause him enormous stress and mental anguish once it is all done, because the time will be gone.
And notice how the briefing was constructed, not one dramatic announcement, but a slow drip. One detail to one outlet, a second detail to another, each piece landing just close enough together to suggest coordination without ever quite confirming it. That is not an accident. That is a deliberate choice. This kind of slow drip strategy is deliberate. It lets the story build momentum in the public conversation while giving the Sussex camp room to deny, soften, or just let the speculation run whichever works best for them. Here's the thing about emergency framing in royal stories. It works because nobody wants to be the one who dismissed a real reconciliation. Nobody wants to look cold about a grandfather wanting to see his grandchildren while he still can. That emotional pull is exactly what makes this kind of carefully managed urgency so effective, no matter how much of it turns out to be real. But before we go further, there's an obvious question that needs to be asked.
No way can William or Catherine ever be around Meghan again, because And let's say I don't like you and I have to be pleasant to you. But if you feel slighted because perhaps I'm not as effusive as you'd like me to be, then what are you going to do? Say I'm a racist? That will happen again, because in her mind, if we look at Meghan, in her mind, no one could possibly not love her. And so if they're cold to her, it must only be one thing.
If the children really are coming to Britain, if Archie and Lilibet really are about to set foot in the country their father grew up in, what happens once they're here? Two small children cannot simply disappear into a private estate. Cameras exist, photographers exist. The British press does not miss things like this, which means any visit involving the children almost certainly means photographs. And photographs, when it comes to the Sussexes, are never just photographs. They are assets. They are content, worth serious money. There's also the question of logistics, and this part matters more than people realize. A genuine emergency visit driven by real urgency tends to look chaotic. Last-minute flights, minimal planning, no careful coordination with friendly outlets. What we're actually seeing looks very different considered briefings, specific outlets chosen for specific audiences, language carefully calibrated to generate maximum sympathy. That doesn't mean the urgency is fake, but it does mean the urgency, whatever its source, is being managed rather than simply lived through. Paula Froelich, never one to hold back, was blunt about exactly where this could lead the outfit. Sold. Possibly the children's outfits too, sold.
Charles has made it very clear that he wants Harry back. You know, we saw it in Harry's book. Don't make my life a misery, but don't make my final years a misery, boys. Charles's dearest wish is to be reconciled with his son. That is it. Charles is a massive romantic. He's like he's a real kind of like, he's very different to William. Like, William is completely Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II is very kind of, just cold, frankly. She was cold about personal things.
Not speculation dressed up as fact, but an honest, lived assessment from someone who has watched this exact pattern play out for years. Because here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. The one thing the Sussexes simply cannot do by precedent, by convention, by basic decency, is turn the monarchy into a retail catalogue. And yet that line has been approached, tested, and quietly crossed more than once. So when Froelich raises the possibility that even children's clothing could become merchandise, it doesn't sound like an exaggeration. It sounds like a pattern being called out straight. Nearly every corner of royal life that's come within reach has been folded into the Sussex content machine. Anniversaries, milestones, even deeply personal moments have found their way onto the content calendar. There's little reason to believe an emotional reunion with a seriously ill grandfather would be handled any differently, however uncomfortable that sounds. And that's what makes the emergency framing of this trip so hard to sit with. Because if the urgency is real, if Charles is truly running out of time, and Harry is racing to reach him, then packaging that moment for commercial gain moves into an entirely different category, not opportunistic.
It's the same thing he did with King Charles a couple months ago when he let it be known through a source, wink, friend, wink, that he would be happy to accept an invitation to Sandringham, but of course, he would only go if his wife and kids were there, and that.
Oh yeah, and if there's full security paid for by people like me.
And if he knew who else was going to be there.
Something considerably darker. Set the commercial questions aside for a moment because there's something far more human happening underneath all of this. Something that explains better than any PR calculation why this trip may genuinely be different. Charles has spent years navigating a serious health journey that, by every account, has sharpened his awareness of how much time he actually has left. And those who know him not as a public figure, but as a father, describe a man whose deepest, most private wish has nothing to do with duty or protocol. His deepest wish is simply to be reconciled with his son. That's worth sitting with. Because so much coverage of this family treats every development like a chess move, a strategy, a position being played for advantage. And some of it genuinely is. But underneath that chessboard, there is a father, an aging father who has reportedly said, in his own words, "Do not make my final years a misery." there's something quietly devastating about a king having to say that at all.
Harry and Meghan basically are laying down the ground and running with a narrative in the hope that there's going to be a change. And there's not going to be a change of any significance. Yes, Harry will get some security. Every time Harry comes, if he gives notice, he gets security. That's not news. That's old.
A man who waited his entire adult life to wear the crown, who spent decades preparing for a role that finally arrived, and the thing he wants most isn't more power, more ceremony, more duty fulfilled. It's simply his son back. The chance to know his grandchildren before time runs out. That's not a constitutional concern. That's the most human concern there is. Tom Sykes drew a contrast that explains a lot about why Charles responds to Harry so differently than William does. Charles is a romantic someone who believes, almost against the evidence, in the power of reconciliation. William, by contrast, inherited something closer to his grandmother's temperament: a coolness, a discipline, an ability to separate emotion from decision-making that has served the institution well, but leaves very little room for sentiment, especially when sentiment has been repeatedly betrayed. That difference, Charles's longing versus William's caution, is the exact tension this entire visit is being built around. Harry knows his father wants this. And a father frightened of running out of time is far more likely to say yes to a visit that his more guarded advisors would otherwise shut down. It's worth asking honestly whether the people advising Harry fully understand this dynamic. Because if Charles truly is the romantic Sykes describes a man who leads with his heart, even when his head has every reason for caution, then that emotional openness becomes, whether intentionally or not, a point of leverage.
Is Tom Sykes right that the children will be unveiled on this trip? Because this is always the calculation. How on earth can you keep the children not pictured if they are meeting members of the royal family?
They've done it before. I mean, they have come for the Queen's Jubilee and nobody saw the children. So they could actually bring the children, hide away. They don't necessarily need to unveil the children. And if they did, it would be just the most striking act of hypocrisy we've ever seen on several levels.
Not necessarily a cold, calculated one. Harry may genuinely want nothing more than reconciliation, but genuine love and strategic advantage are not mutually exclusive. And the people around Charles, the ones whose job it is to protect him from exactly this kind of emotional exposure, are watching this unfold with considerably less romance and a great deal more caution. Which brings us to the part that deserves real scrutiny, because wanting something and being entitled to get it entirely on your own terms are two very different things. There is a pattern in how Harry has approached every attempt at reconciliation since leaving royal life, and it recurs with almost mechanical regularity. It typically goes like this. A source close to Harry quietly lets it be known that he would be open to a meeting at Sandringham, privately, whatever the occasion. But that openness always comes with conditions attached. His wife must be included. His children must be included. Full security covered by the institution must be guaranteed. And he generally wants to know in advance exactly who else will be in the room. It is not an unconditional olive branch. It is a negotiation conducted through intermediaries with every condition carefully designed to protect Harry's position, no matter how the meeting actually unfolds. If the visit goes well, it gets framed as a triumphant reunion.
Harry is having some conversations. Something is happening that is drawing him back to, family, seeing his father before it's too late. We have to also remember that Harry had a huge regret around what happened with his mother before she passed. And I think Harry sees it happening again now with his father. And that is the urgency that he is feeling about getting back to the UK and having his children meet their grandfather. So this is also Harry trying to not repeat history.
If it goes badly, the conditions provide convenient cover. The security was inadequate, the access too limited, the circumstances never quite right. What's striking about this pattern is how consistently it shields Harry from ever being the one who simply says no. He never refuses reconciliation outright. He attaches enough conditions that it either happens entirely on his terms or it doesn't happen at all and the blame lands somewhere else. It's a remarkably effective negotiating posture. But those who have watched it play out repeatedly suggest it's not actually about reconciliation, it's about control. And it's precisely this pattern that has made experienced royal commentators deeply skeptical that this trip represents anything genuinely new. It's also worth noting how this pattern functions even when it fails. Every time a proposed reconciliation falls apart over one of these conditions, the public narrative tends to settle on the idea that the palace was simply too rigid, too unforgiving, unwilling to extend an olive branch. Rarely does the conversation turn to the fact that the conditions themselves set by Harry's camp before any negotiation even began may have been engineered to be difficult to meet. That gap in how blame gets distributed is, quietly, one of the most effective parts of the entire strategy. Lady Colin Campbell, who has watched this family longer and more closely than almost anyone in royal commentary, was withering in her assessment of what's actually likely to change. Nothing.
I think she's part of that, because what you just laid out there makes complete sense. Why wouldn't it just would seem logical that he would bring the children under those circumstances? Okay, I mean, goodness knows they've got things that we don't even know about, right? So why can't you do that?
That's essentially her verdict. The groundwork is being laid, the narrative is being run, hope is being cultivated headline after headline. But the underlying reality, in her view, remains stubbornly unchanged. Harry will get some security for this trip because he always does when proper notice is given. That's not news, that's the same arrangement that has existed for years. What would actually be news is a permanent restoration of status, a meaningful structural change to where Harry and Meghan actually stand in relation to the institution. And at the time of this recording, there is no credible evidence that anything of that magnitude is even on the table. Sit with how deflating that is against the emotional framing surrounding this trip. A father who fears running out of time, a son who fears repeating old mistakes, and underneath all of it, according to one of the sharpest observers of this family, essentially no structural change whatsoever. The emergency may be entirely real on a human level, while changing absolutely nothing on an institutional one. So why does it feel urgent? Why does this trip carry an energy that previous Invictus visits haven't? The honest answer may simply be that Charles's health has made everyone around this story acutely aware that time, for the first time in this entire saga, may genuinely be running out.
Meghan Markle and Prince Harry believed that they were going to push Catherine, the Princess of Wales, making her return to Royal Ascot for the first time since her illness, off the front page. And as you will see, that failed miserably. And indeed, it failed miserably because we love the authenticity of Catherine, a royal who we relate to.
And that brings us back to the children. Because whatever the underlying motivation's genuine urgency, carefully managed PR moment, or some complicated combination of both, the practical question remains: what actually happens to Archie and Lilibet if this trip goes ahead as described? The precedent for keeping the children out of sight does exist. They came for the late Queen's Jubilee and were never photographed private estate, careful logistics, minimal exposure. It's been done before and could be done again. But here's the complication that makes this trip fundamentally different from anything that came before it. If this truly is about Charles meeting his grandchildren, if the urgent framing being used by sources close to Harry is accurate, then a meeting with the king almost certainly means royal residences, royal staff, royal photographers documenting the visit for the institutional record. And the moment that happens, keeping the children out of frame becomes nearly impossible. There's also the matter of scale. A quiet appearance at the late Queen's Jubilee, with thousands of people in attendance and the family kept deliberately at the margins, is a completely different logistical proposition from a dedicated private meeting between a king and his grandchildren. The smaller and more intimate the gathering, the harder it becomes to keep the children hidden because there are simply fewer places for them to disappear into. Which means if this meeting genuinely takes place, the reveal the public has been speculating about for years may happen not through a carefully staged photo shoot but almost by accident, as a natural consequence of where the meeting occurs and who is in the room documenting it. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what has insiders increasingly convinced that something about this particular visit really is different. Dina.
It is absolutely diplomatically impossible, is it not, for King Charles and Queen Camilla to even fathom a meeting with Harry and Meghan, even if their heart did desire that. So this pressure feels very unfair.
Who has spoken about Harry's state of mind with unusual personal candor, kept returning to one theme. Harry is haunted by a regret he has already lived through once. He has spoken publicly and at length about the time he didn't have with his mother, the words left unsaid, the relationship left unfinished, the realization that arrived only after it was too late to do anything about it. Those close to him believe that same fear, the fear of repeating that exact mistake, is now driving his urgency around his father in a way nothing else quite has. And if that's true, there is a genuinely sympathetic human story sitting at the center of all this commercial calculation and media strategy. A son who watched himself run out of time once before, now terrified of watching that clock run out again. That fear doesn't need to be performed or manufactured to be real. Grief has a long memory. And the fear of repeating it is one of the most powerful motivators a person can carry regardless of every other complicated thing happening around it. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly in the background of every decision, every hesitation, every late-night conversation about whether now is finally the right moment to act before it's too late to act at all. But sympathy for Harry's fear does not erase the question of who exactly is controlling the terms on which that fear gets resolved. Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. According to those who watch this dynamic most closely, the obstacle standing between Harry and a straightforward private visit to see his father is not the palace. It's not security logistics. It's not even William's well-documented reluctance. According to Dina, who was direct about this, it's Meghan. The conditions, the demands, the complications, full security, full attendance, the insistence on terms rather than simply showing up are, in this reading, driven less by Harry himself than by the woman standing beside him. Harry, in this framing, behaves like someone who knows what he wants but defers entirely to his wife on how to get it. And if that assessment holds any truth at all, it means the urgency Harry feels about his father's health is being filtered through a set of demands that may have very little to do with urgency and a great deal to do with control. Consider the basic logistics for a moment. If a son genuinely fears his father is running out of time, the simplest path forward is the most direct one: a phone call, a quiet arrangement, a flight kept as small and uncomplicated as possible. What we're instead watching is a sequence of conditions, intermediaries, and carefully timed press briefings. That is not how urgency behaves. That is how negotiation behaves. And the gap between those two things is, according to those closest to the situation, largely explained by who is actually setting the terms. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility that the one thing standing between a ticking clock and a simple, quiet visit between a father and his son is not circumstance. It is choice. And here's where the timing of all of this becomes almost impossible to ignore. Because while this entire urgency narrative was being constructed and briefed across multiple outlets, something else was happening in plain sight, something that exposed exactly how little control the Sussex operation actually has over public sentiment. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, returned to Royal Ascot for the first time since her illness. And by every account, the timing of certain Sussex announcements appeared, whether consciously or not, designed to compete for the same news cycle. This was not the first time either. There is a long, well-documented pattern of major Sussex announcements landing suspiciously close to significant moments for the Wales family. Close enough that even royal commentators who are otherwise sympathetic to Harry have started calling it out publicly. Whether this particular instance was deliberate or simply unfortunate coincidence is impossible to say with certainty, but the pattern itself has become impossible to ignore. And it did not work. Every single front page belonged to Catherine, not because of strategy, not because of careful media management, but because the British public responded instantly and overwhelmingly to something real. A woman who had fought through serious illness and showed up anyway, smiling, present, unguarded. That is perhaps the single most important fact sitting underneath this entire emergency trip narrative. You cannot manufacture urgency the way you can manufacture warmth. Catherine's reception was not engineered. It simply happened because years of authentic, unglamorous service had already done the work. Whatever happens with Harry's trip, whether driven by genuine urgency, careful brand management, or some uneasy mixture of both, it will be measured by the public against that same standard. And that is a standard the Sussex operation has never yet managed to meet. It's also worth remembering what was actually being asked of the public on that particular day. Choose between a woman who has earned over a decade of quiet trust through illness, grief, and steady service, or a story about children nobody has seen, framed through sources nobody can verify, about a meeting that may never even take place. When the choice is laid out that plainly, it's far less surprising that the outcome wasn't close. So, where does that leave things? With a father who may be running out of time, with two children who may, almost by accident, finally be seen on British soil, with a palace that has confirmed nothing and sources that have confirmed everything, and a gap between those two positions wide enough to drive every headline this story has generated. Here's what can be said with real confidence. Buckingham Palace's position has not moved. Not publicly, not privately, not in any meaningful structural way. Diplomatically, practically, and emotionally, a full reconciliation involving Meghan remains, by every credible account, close to impossible. The briefings being fed to sympathetic outlets may produce a private, narrow meeting between Charles and his grandchildren. But they are very unlikely to produce anything more than that, and anyone suggesting otherwise is either not paying attention or is actively invested in a different outcome. It's worth understanding why that ceiling exists, because it doesn't come from cruelty or institutional coldness. It comes from experience. The palace has watched this pattern play out enough times now to know what a carefully coordinated briefing campaign looks like and what it tends to produce. They have seen the warm language, the emotional framing, the strategic drip of details to selected outlets. They have watched moments of genuine openness be converted into content. They have watched private conversations surface in books and interviews, and they have drawn their own conclusions about what unconditional trust placed in this particular operation tends to cost. That is not bitterness, that is institutional memory. And it is precisely why the silence from the palace, which so many headlines have framed as coldness or rigidity, is actually something closer to hard-won caution. A caution that has been earned the difficult way, through repeated experience of what happens when that caution is set aside. And yet, and this is the part that refuses to resolve neatly, none of that institutional caution changes what is happening on a human level. Charles is a father. He is an aging father navigating a serious health journey with an awareness, shared by everyone around him, that the window for certain things is narrowing. The reconciliation he wants is not a constitutional matter. It is not a diplomatic negotiation. It is something far simpler and far harder than either of those things. It is a father wanting his son back before it is too late to have him back. That desire is real. It has been confirmed by too many credible sources across too long a period to be dismissed as spin or sentiment. And it sits in direct, uncomfortable tension with everything else this story contains. The commercial calculation, the conditions, the carefully timed briefings, the pattern of managed urgency that has characterized every previous attempt at reconciliation. All of it exists alongside a genuinely human story that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The question that nobody in royal commentary has yet managed to answer cleanly is this: can both things be true at the same time? Can Harry genuinely fear losing his father while also allowing that fear to be packaged and deployed as leverage? Can the urgency be real and manufactured simultaneously, each feeding the other in ways that even the people involved may not be fully conscious of? The honest answer is yes. People are complicated. Grief is complicated. Fear is complicated. And the Sussex operation, whatever its faults, is not staffed by cartoon villains who feel nothing and calculate everything. There are real emotions underneath the strategy. The strategy simply ensures those emotions are never left unmanaged, never allowed to express themselves in ways that might be costly or unpredictable or outside the frame that has been constructed around them. Which brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question this entire story raises. Not whether Harry loves his father, he almost certainly does. Not whether Charles wants reconciliation, he almost certainly does. But whether the structure that has been built around both of those genuine feelings is actually designed to allow reconciliation to happen, or whether it is designed to ensure that reconciliation always remains just out of reach. Close enough to generate sympathy, far enough away to avoid the vulnerability that genuine reconciliation would actually require. Because genuine reconciliation is not a press briefing. It is not a coordinated drip of details to selected outlets. It is not a sequence of conditions negotiated through intermediaries. Genuine reconciliation is messy and private and deeply uncomfortable, and it does not come with a content calendar attached. It requires someone, at some point, to show up without guarantees, to arrive without conditions, to sit in a room and be willing to be wrong and be hurt, and be seen without the protection of a carefully managed narrative. That is what has been missing from every previous attempt, and there is as yet no evidence that this particular trip will be any different in that fundamental respect. The logistics may change, the timing may change, the emotional stakes, sharpened by Charles's health, are certainly higher than they have ever been before. But the underlying structure conditions, intermediaries, managed briefings, protection of position appears, from every available signal, to remain exactly as it has always been. And that structure, more than any security arrangement or scheduling conflict or palace reluctance, is what stands between where things are now and the quiet, private, genuinely human reconciliation that everyone on every side of this story claims to want. So where does hope actually live in all of this? Perhaps in the one variable that cannot be fully managed or controlled: time itself. Because there is a version of this story in which the clock runs down far enough that the conditions fall away on their own, in which urgency becomes so real and so immediate that the scaffolding of strategy simply cannot hold, in which Harry gets on a plane not because the terms have been agreed and the briefings have been timed and the outfits are ready to be logged, but because the alternative is something he has already lived through once and cannot survive living through again. That version of events requires something the Sussex operation has never publicly demonstrated: the willingness to arrive unguarded, to show up not as a brand or a narrative or a carefully positioned figure in an ongoing story, but simply as a son, imperfect, frightened, and running out of time to get this right. Whether that version of Harry is accessible, whether it can surface through everything that has been built around him, is perhaps the most genuinely open question this story contains. And it is the one question that no amount of briefing or source management or carefully timed announcement can answer in advance. Only the moment itself will answer it, and the moment, if it comes, will be unmistakable precisely because it will look nothing like everything that came before it. No coordinated outlets, no strategic drip, no conditions negotiated in advance. Just a son walking through a door because his father is on the other side of it, and time is no longer something either of them can afford to waste. That is ultimately the version of this story worth hoping for, not the one with the most dramatic headline. Not the one that generates the most coverage or the most commercial opportunity or the most perfectly timed announcement. Simply the smallest, quietest, most human version of events. A father, a son, and whatever reconciliation can still be salvaged before the clock everyone keeps talking about finally runs out. And perhaps that narrow outcome, a quiet, limited meeting free of cameras, content calendars, and everything else that has complicated every previous attempt, would actually be the best possible result for everyone involved, including the two children at the center of it all. Not a staged reveal. Not a brand moment, just a grandfather meeting his grandchildren in private, with no agenda beyond the meeting itself. Before we go, there's something worth putting to you directly, because this one genuinely divides people. If Charles really is running out of time, does that change how you feel about this visit happening at all, even if it arrives wrapped in PR strategy? Or does the manner in which it has been handled matter just as much as whether it happens? And here's the second question, because it sits right alongside the first. If you were in Charles's position, knowing everything we now know about how these visits tend to be managed, having watched the pattern repeat itself again and again, would you still say yes? Would the chance to see your grandchildren outweigh every reasonable concern about how that moment might ultimately be used? Drop your answer in the comments, because this one is genuinely worth the conversation, and we want to hear exactly where you land. If this story gave you something to think about, hit that like button, it makes a real difference. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Share this one with someone who follows the royals closely, because this story is far from over. There is, by every indication, a great deal more still to come. We'll see you in the next one.